And the third metric, so that's my 3, the third metric, if you like, is to think about the unemployed. And if you look at unemployment rates, they hover similar to other regions in the world except for Latin America, at about 10% for youth unemployment rates, slightly lower for aggregate unemployment rates. So you've got a large proportion of the working poor, you've got youth unemployment rates at about 10%, you've got the wage employed who are sitting at about 20-odd%. The question I want to ask about the wage employed, which bugs me, is this, the data you often see looks like this, but the question I want to ask next is a slightly provocative one, right? Is what share of the wage employed are in fact employed in the public sector, right? And that was a worrying statistic. I didn't have this number at my fingertips, and when I did the data, it did surprise me in a negative way. It's that 57% of the wage employed in Africa are actually in public sector jobs. So think of it differently, 43%, right, of your wage employed, only 43% are actually in private sector jobs. So when you think of urban, high productivity, formal sector jobs, most of those are actually in the public sector for Africa. And that, for me, is a worry. If one is thinking of the private sector, the other arm of the AfDB, right, the private sector as an engine of growth, that is a particularly worrying outcome. So I mentioned my 4-3-2-1 model. So what this means that if we have a linear segmentation, if we have a linear model, so if we think about the future as just a reflection of the past, and so the segmentation that we currently have in the labor market will be reproduced for young people, what does that suggest young people's probabilities of outcomes in the labor market will look like, using the term very loosely? And that's essentially it, right? Take the left, and I'm rounding up, right? 40% of young people will end up in working poverty, right? 30-odd% will end up as in non-wage, non-working poverty. 20-odd% will end up in wage employment. Remember, the majority of whom will be in the public sector, and 10% in unemployment. And that, for me, is a real challenge that we face, that if this is the segmentation, there are all sorts of drivers and mechanisms and levers we need to think about in terms of alternative growth trajectories, which leads me to thinking about one of the concerns that always comes out, and I'll go through this very quickly as I run out of time, is about wages. So the new data from the World Bank is actually quite instructive. It uses household survey and labor force survey data to aggregate up. It turns out that wages are not a problem. So we're not finding that we've got unusually high wages in Africa. Even if you look at it relative GDP, we are not overpaying if you look at the common regression line. We are, though, paying far too much in the public sector relative to the private sector, right? So there is a wage gap problem, but in general, wages are not the key deterrent to competitiveness, right? So, second big story. What do we think about structural transformation? Is the Lewis model dead? This is now a raging debate amongst economists. The old structural transformation path was this one, which is Asia since 1975, and you compare productivity against employment share, and what you see is a clear shift. It's almost a visual representation of how manufacturing was front and center of long-run economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa. And if the pointer works, you can see the arrow showing us as we move from agriculture into manufacturing in Asia. Manufacturing then becomes the employment generator and almost the lifeblood of a long-run growth trajectory. That's the Lewis model. People move into urban areas, get low-wage jobs en masse, and you move up the value chain. What does sub-Saharan Africa look like for this period? Very different. Our structural transformation has been from agriculture into this thing called WRT, which is wholesale and retail trade. Again, something picked up earlier this morning. We've seen a transition not into urban low-wage manufacturing jobs, but into urban informal sector jobs, low productivity services jobs. So the structural transformation of the past is no longer the case in not just Africa, as it turns out. In many other non-African countries, you're seeing this premature deindustrialization. Manufacturing is beginning to flatline, something we can debate later. What has happened in its place? So some country data in terms of manufacturing. You can pick a country in sub-Saharan Africa and in North Africa, and you will find a decline in manufacturing as a share of GDP. Nigeria is probably one of the most spectacular, as well as South Africa. What has come in its place? Well, there's something else going on, right? There's this growth of services as a share of GDP. So if you look at the 52.2%, which is services share of GDP, that suddenly spikes to about 59%, but look at manufacturing, right? So I'm aggregating here, but manufacturing share of GDP, captured in the main by industry, declines. So that's that shift, right, from agriculture into services. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Yes, it is generating employment. So if you look at changes over time and you just look at the blue bars, right, you'll see, the green bars, you'll see that the green share gets higher, which is manufacturing share, services share of employment has grown. But what I'm interested in is what type of services. Services is heterogeneous, right? And what I've done in this simple 4-country sample study is to break down services. You'll see there in the bold, right? I've taken services, wholesale and retail, think of that as urban informal sector jobs, government jobs, and modern services. So when we think of services as telecoms, right, when you think of financial and business services, backroom credit card recons and so on, all that fancy modern services, that's only in the sample constitutes 9% of employment generation over the period in Africa. So services as the new model relies on the work being done by modern services, certainly not low productivity informal sector jobs, and certainly not the public sector. And that for me is a huge challenge going forward. Modern services, though, is growing very fast. So if you look at the data, it is growing faster than the other services, but I would argue off too low a base. And one can talk about the skills requirements thereof. Now, let me conclude with a quick story about what I think is an alternative to thinking about the rather messy description of economic growth as a structural transformation between manufacturing and services. Doesn't really take us to a place where we can think clearly about policy choices, I would argue, for African leaders. And here I want to propose a fairly new and innovative way, which is unfortunately not mine, I wish it was mine, from Harvard University, called the notion of economic complexity. And I want to lead, before I give you all the details and the data and so on, with a story. And forgive me if many of you have heard my story before. And the story takes you to the 1850s, where a chemist named Robert Cheeseborough, and I promise you I'm going somewhere. Robert Cheeseborough went to the oil fields in Pennsylvania, and he realized that the oil workers were taking the residue, the leftover stuff from the oil, and they were rubbing it on their hands when they had cuts. And he said the residue from the oil, he realized, being a chemist, and chemists either heat things or they cool things, right? That's what they do. He realized that if he engaged in a chemical process, which I identify there, from petroleum, he can get petroleum jelly, which is Vaseline. But what Robert Cheeseborough did was to move to the nearest product from oil. He moved to petroleum jelly through producing it, through packaging it, through sending it all around the US, to patenting it. He basically built an entire petroleum jelly industry. And the US then became the largest exporter of petroleum jelly in the 1850s. They moved from oil to petroleum jelly. Nigeria is the 5th largest exporter of oil in the world. Nigeria still imports petroleum jelly. And so in many ways, the notion of economic complexity is to move to the products where you have current capabilities and move to the nearby products. If you are in iron and steel, go to cutlery. If you are in wool, go to clothing, go to towels. Don't go from what Ricardo Hausmann says, don't go from clothes to jet engines. Doesn't make sense. Go where you have capabilities to the nearest product. So can you think about this? Yes, you can think about this process as a process of building economic complexity. As you accumulate capabilities from petroleum jelly to other sorts of medicines to pharmaceuticals, you build economic complexity. Japan's the most complex economy in the world. If you compare complexity against GDP, there's a very clear correlation where low GDP economies have low levels of complexity, high GDP economies have higher levels of complexity. If you're above or below the regression line, there's some interesting nuances, but that's essentially the point. Now, if you think about Robert Cheeseborough, the advantage of economic complexity is that there's the cousin of economic complexity is something called product space analytics. You can generate product spaces that coagulate around each other, and I've got to show it to you for you to understand it. So this is a global description of every single product outside of services, from agriculture to manufacturing. In the middle, you have something called a machinery cluster. You have a pharmaceutical cluster. You have chemicals clusters, because products are related to each other. Economists don't think about these things, but scientists do, right? It's like you have a clothing cluster over there. Think of apples and apple juice, closely related to each other. If you can grow really good apples, don't try and make jet engines. Try and make apple juice. This is based on actual data, export data for countries around the world. And I'm going to show you 4 product spaces for different countries. That's Kenya's. If the dot is colored, it means that you're exporting it. The larger the dot that's colored, the larger the export volume. You can see clusters in Kenya. I don't want to go into details, I don't have time. But you can see the cut flowers cluster having led to some sort of apparels and textiles cluster. The point is for Kenya to look at its economic complexity profile and not try and build something over there, but to stick with where it has existing capabilities. The idea is to move to the nearest products, to move from clothing to towels, to move from apples to apple juice. Don't move from apples to tractors, right? And the idea of economic complexity is to think about where your capabilities lie, and I'll show you the other 2 while I'm talking, where your capabilities lie, find your oil, and then go and build a factory in petroleum jelly. And the way you figure this out in a more nuanced way is to speak to firms. And firms will often tell you, they will not say we need lots of skilled people or we need a better primary schooling system or better skills. Firms will tell you, actually, we need veterinary scientists to actually verify that the cows we are producing are actually certified by the EU. And that's their constraint. Capability constraints that disallow growth are in fact very, very narrowly determined. And I would argue, in closing, that in thinking about economic complexity as a new and innovative way for economic growth at the product level gives us entirely different and unique opportunities. So in closing, young people, as we know, are going to dominate the globe as a share of the population, but they're going to dominate in Africa, right? That's not just a challenge for not an opportunity only for consumers, but a challenge for growth and employment. I would argue that the current growth trajectory based on low productivity services is not going to generate the kinds of good jobs we want, and perhaps the idea of thinking about economic complexity and micro-industrial policy is one avenue for generating the jobs for the future. Thank you very much.
We thank Professor Haroon for this valuable points that he shared that would open a wide range of questions during the panel discussion that will be led by my colleague, Mr. Tapera Muzira, the coordinator, Jobs for Youth in Africa Strategy, African Development Bank. Mr. Tapera, please join on stage. I also invite the panelists that will share in this session. Dr. Tariq Galel Shawi, Minister of Education and Technical Education in Egypt. Dr. Tariq, please join. Dr. Hanan Morsi, Director of Macroeconomic Policy, Forecasting and Research Department, African Development Bank. Mr. Raymond Gelbin, Chief Economist and Head Strategy, Research and Analysis, United Nations Development Programme. Mr. Adam El-Hiraika, Director of Macroeconomics and Governance Division, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Ms. Juliana Ratufosan, Interim President, Pan-African Youth Union. Now I leave you to enjoy warming up the questions with Mr. Tapera And the panel will be for a whole hour. That will make us postpone the lunch for a while. Enjoy the discussion.
Okay. Okay, very good day to you all. I think let's get straight into the session. I'm conscious that we are running behind time, but we're going to try and see how far we can cover the subject, as important as it is. So we're going to start the discussion on youth employment, skills, and entrepreneurship for Africa's development. And I have a few questions based on the very good context which has been set. I'm going to start with the Minister of Education and Minister of Education and Technical and Vocational Training. There is a sense that for some reason the private sector is looking for skills and they are not there. What is your take as a Minister of Education? What is it we should do to close that skills gap?
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for an excellent question. And I guess I have to address the subject of the conference from about jobs and skills and entrepreneurship from the angle of capacity building. Let me say in the beginning that I really believe that the cornerstone of any of the developing countries to move forward is to invest in the human element. And no matter what else we do, it's the humans at the end of the day who will run all of these things and drive it forward. In Egypt, we are really transforming our education system, whether it's general education or technical education. But coming to your question about skills, what you noticed is perfectly true, unfortunately, that the private sector, there is a mismatch between what the education system is pumping out and what the private sector and the industrial landscape is looking for. That's because it was always a supply-driven kind of education system that just, but there is also a cultural issue here. The culture of looking for paper certifications and not for real skills. And that's in the minds of people. All parents want a degree for their children, not real skills. And that's a big battle, understanding what are we coming here to do. It's the social status acquired by a degree that drives most people over skills. And over demand for education causes it to be just a set of machinery, and people want to get high grades whether they mean something or not. The employers don't find the right skills at the end of the day. So they either have to retrain people or restart all of this. It's a lot of money wasted on these paper certificates. The other thing is, part of the culture also is the negative culture associated with technical education in many countries, that people think that the best thing is to become an engineer or a lawyer, so they want that over real true skills that drove economies like Germany and others forward. In Egypt, we tried to solve this problem. I think we have a very nice model, maybe we can learn from. We tried to rebrand the entire technical education business, and we gave a new name. We call it Applied Technology, and it's actually a triangular model. I think this is the opposite of what was offered before. It's industry-driven rather than education-driven. So what we do is we agree with an industrial partner, the government, the industrial partner, and the third party here is the quality control or the accreditation body. So it's a triangle of three partners. We give the schools, the teachers, the infrastructure, the curricula to the industrial partner who takes over of managing this school. And it's a dual system, borrowing that from the German model of the dual system, where the students attend 4 days in the factory or the industrial setting and 2 days of theoretical study. But the school is run completely by the industrial partner who gives incentives to teachers, pumps up the labs. So it's a win-win situation. And usually they prepare those students to work in the factories. So the students are almost guaranteed a job, and they take it very seriously. And also the industrial partner who puts money takes it very seriously. They don't want to waste their money, so they want to get really skilled people at the end of the day. So it's not about paper certificate anymore. It's about real skills and real jobs. That model, we opened it up only last year. We opened about 15 schools of such nature. And to our surprise, the best students in town applied for it, which is a huge cultural shift. It used to be, honestly, that after 9th grade, we divert students to general education and technical education. And the percentage was 53% go to technical education, the old style, and 47% go to general education. Why they go? Because those who score lower grades are punished, quote unquote, by going to technical education. That was the system we're trying to get rid of. Now, with the new schools, the best students in 9th grade stand in line to go and become chief technologists. That's really a very positive sign. And they're even given money during study because they work 4 days in the factory. So for the parents, now they understand the kids learn, get paid, guaranteed a job, and the quality control is assured by the partner who cares to train them well, and also a third independent quality controller who accredits those degrees. So that model has been really very successful, and we think if we multiply, we will provide the industrial landscape with the skills they need. It's really driven by them in this model than the other way around.
Right, thank you very much. I think it's very good you emphasize the fact that there has to be a partnership between the industry, government, and providers of education and skills training to make sure that they provide the skills that are required. And I'm quite impressed with what your government is doing. But let me move on to Dr. Mosi. From a policy perspective, building on to what Professor Borat, the observations he made, what is your take from the Africa Development Bank side in terms of what is happening on the continent on this issue?
So I think we all know that the continent is a young continent. The issue is not just that it's young; it's getting younger. So the share of the amount of the numbers of youth will double, over the by 2050. And if you combine this with the global trend of what is happening everywhere, so you can think of it while the rest of the world is aging, we're only getting younger. I wish it was true for all of us.
Right.
So it's a huge opportunity for the continent if we get it right. And the issue is, how can we do that? So the continent has been showing a strong, solid growth over the last few years, with average over 4% for the continent. However, it has not been creating enough jobs. So we didn't have sufficient job creation with this type of solid growth track record. So part of what we need to do is to tackle how can we actually have a more job creating growth, and what can be done. Part of it will be actually the type of structural transformation that the continent needs. And in here, what I'm talking about the continent moving from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors, because this is actually how you can ensure that the youth not only get jobs, but they get decent jobs. You need jobs that they can actually earn a decent living with, not just any job. So by increasing the productivity, this is how you can actually ensure that this goes on. Also, by removing obstacles to the private sector, the challenge that is facing the continent cannot just be met by the governments only. The government have a vital role to play, but this is really will need the collaborative efforts from all stakeholders, and the private sector will have a key role to play, because this is really where we're going to need to see more of the job creation. We need to have a change in what the statistics our colleague Harun have shown, that basically, we have the majority of the jobs actually more on the public side. The continent cannot afford this going forward. With all the fiscal situation, the debt situation, what we need to ensure is that we actually have these job opportunities coming from the private sector. We need to ensure that we have an enabling environment where these jobs can be created. And I think we are fortunate that in the continent we have actually the highest entrepreneurship in the world. Like, 30, almost close to 30%. So in itself, this is a huge opportunity. The challenge is, once these entrepreneurs start, how we can ensure that they don't get stuck at infancy, which is usually what happens in the continent. How can we make sure that they're actually growing from small to medium to large, and hence creating jobs for the youth, and accelerating in both the growth and the inclusiveness of that growth, including for youth. So these are the type of things that we will really need to address, and of course, a vital part of it will be the skills and education side, by ensuring that what the education system is delivering is what the firms need. And beyond that also is what will be needed in the future, because with all the global trends that are happening, there is technological advances, there is a shift in the way that industries have been revolutionized to have more technological content, to have more artificial intelligence. So how can we not only prepare them for now and what the firms and the marketplace needs, but how can we prepare them for the future? And we can discuss perhaps a bit more later on what is needed to get there.
Okay, let me pick on that and perhaps invite Mr. Gilpin from the UNDP. I mean, quite clearly here, we see that skills, future skills are also as important as the skills that are required now. And of course, Dr. Mosi says that not just jobs, but decent jobs. So what do we do? Are we structured enough to prepare our young people for the future? What can UNDP do in terms of providing support and advice to governments in Africa as well as the private sector?
Thank you very much. This is one of those wicked problems that challenge you to think, and Professor, I think Burat earlier, I think challenged us. Because one thing that we don't normally do is allow ourselves to be led by the data. What is the data telling us on this particular issue? Not what is our knee-jerk or what advocacy is driving us towards, but what is the data telling us about what sort of skills we need. The Minister of Education this morning was talking a lot about some of the work that's been done here in Egypt. And the bankers also talked about about banking reform. In most African countries, we still have legacy institutions that are extractive by nature, that we really haven't addressed. what's the data telling us about that? We're talking about youth entrepreneurship as a driver for growth, etc. What's the data telling us about that? There was a very interesting article that was published by two researchers from MIT and Northeastern University in the US that talked about the average age for a successful entrepreneur is 45. Below 30, the likelihood of success is 1.8 times less. So how are we preparing the young generation? So it's not just about youth, it's about the sort of skills. But beyond that, it's about the ecosystem that provides three important things. It provides money, that's access to credit. It provides mentorship, that's education and support. And thirdly, something we forget a lot about, the third M in all of this, is it provides access to markets. Because we're talking a lot about growth, about productivity, but where are these goods and services going to be sold? And could they compete in domestic African markets today that have been flooded with goods and services from outside the continent? How are we preparing the next generation? And so a lot of the education, whether it's your traditional academic education, or your traditional technical education, or traditional vocational education, might have been really, really, really good a few decades ago. But you look at the Africa of the future. It's one that sees demographic shifts that we can't even begin to fathom. It's one that sees climate change causing people to move and things to evolve in ways we are not prepared for. It's one that sees more Africans living in urban areas than live in rural areas. It's going to be a switch. And we've really, really not thought through how to invest, because education and skills in this context are not just a social good, they are an investment in Africa's future. Are we investing strategically to prepare for this ecosystem that would allow entrepreneurship to deliver the sorts of jobs, but also to deliver the sorts of wealth generation that Africa needs for the coming decades?
Okay, that's very interesting. Now, Director Erika, let me come to you. He talked about a different Africa in the future and how well we need to get prepared to do that. Now, one of the things is that Africa is coming together into a single market. What are some of the innovative ways we can address this problem from your analysis as ECA?
Thanks, Tabera.
Sorry about that.
Let me refer to some of the data about employment. In line with what Professor Bohrat has presented, ILO data shows that 76.5% of employment in Africa is vulnerable. So even if the jobs are there, they might not be attractive enough even to the unemployed. So that's why almost about 60% of African people are still in agriculture and in rural areas, because there are no decent jobs to move to in cities. Given this, I think this partly explains why it has been very difficult for African countries to reduce poverty. So poverty reduction has been very slow in Africa, and in absolute terms, Africa has the highest number of poor in the world today, which is too high. Therefore, I think we need a holistic approach to address the the youth employment and the unemployment problem in general. So what I would argue for is to have employment targeting strategies. All our strategies should be targeted towards employment, starting with our development vision and plans and moving down to our macroeconomic policies. His Excellency, the Minister of Education, talked well about education policy in Egypt. We need to have an education policy that is linked to our overall development strategy and targeted towards creating jobs, towards producing graduates that are employable and that will have decent jobs rather than vulnerable employment. And then in that context, we have to have detailed labor market policies and strategies that are supported by government and funded. Funding is very critical. Look at government budgets, annual budget. Very often, you might not find even a mention of employment. Or maybe at the end of the budget, one of the projects of the budget is to support employment in very small sectors. And then when you look at the share of education in government budget in most African countries, it is minimal. That's why in many African countries still the rich people, the relatively rich people, even middle-income class people send their children to private schools. That should not happen. And if we allow that to continue to happen, then we will not be able to produce the graduates who are employable. And the other thing I think we need to focus on and to be able to fund is the issue of youth entrepreneurship. Youth entrepreneurship and supporting youth to make use of the skills they learn at school and in college, especially in today's digitalized system. So in my view, having a holistic approach, employment targeting at all policy levels, having specific youth employment programs that are funded by government are critical if you want to address the issue of youth employment.
Very good points there, very good points. It is true that there have been some observations that, the budget is talking about something else. The strategies are talking about something else. So we're going to come back to that later. But there's nothing for young people without young people. So I'm going to turn to Juliana. Juliana, as a young person, and you have heard all of this, what are your views? How can we solve this problem? You are part of the solution. So what are your views on this?
Merci beaucoup pour cette question. Effectivement, l'éducation est vraiment la base de tout développement et de toute réussite de la jeunesse dans le domaine de l'emploi pour lutter contre le chômage. Mais j'ai quelques points à soulever par rapport à l'éducation. Tout d'abord, l'accès à l'éducation. L'accès à l'éducation n'est pas équitable pour les jeunes. Il y en a des jeunes qui sont dans des zones reculées, qui n'ont pas accès à l'éducation, tels que les jeunes qui sont dans les milieux ruraux, dans les milieux urbains. Moi, je propose qu'il faut donner cette éducation équitable à tous les jeunes de l'Afrique, non seulement ceux qui sont dans les grandes villes, mais surtout dans les zones reculées. Aussi, par rapport aux formations professionnelles, aux formations dans les universités, à mon avis, moi je trouve que c'est pas non plus, ça répond pas aux besoins du pays, puisque il y a des formations où il y a des filières au niveau de l'université, mais ça répond pas exactement au contexte que le pays ou l'Afrique vit. Ça répond pas. Moi je propose qu'il faut identifier les ressources existantes. Il faut identifier également les problèmes pour donner l'éducation adéquate aux jeunes afin que les jeunes soient vraiment une valeur ajoutée dans le développement de leur pays et dans le développement de l'Afrique. Aussi par rapport à l'emploi décent, c'est encore difficile pour les jeunes d'avoir cet emploi décent. Pourquoi? Parce que les jeunes n'ont pas vraiment cette opportunité. C'est vrai, on dit souvent qu'il faut donner les opportunités aux jeunes, mais c'est encore un peu difficile. C'est encore un peu difficile, pourquoi? Il y a d'abord la discrimination par rapport aux hommes et des femmes, et aussi pour les recrutements des jeunes au niveau des administrations publiques ou privées, ce n'est pas aussi équitable. Ce n'est pas équitable. Donc il faut vraiment voir cet aspect de création d'emplois pour les jeunes. On se dit souvent qu'il faut impliquer les jeunes dans toutes les décisions leur concernant, mais est-ce vraiment le cas? Est-ce que les jeunes sont vraiment impliqués dès le début? Et on voit souvent dans les recrutements qu'il y a plus des personnes âgées qui tiennent des postes de responsabilité que des jeunes. Alors qu'on se dit que c'est le moment pour les jeunes de prendre en main son avenir. Donc j'incite un peu ces questions. Par rapport, je reviens concernant les formations professionnelles. Il faut que l'éducation soit une réponse par rapport au contexte que le pays ou l'Afrique vit. Et il faut, se référant de ce contexte, adapter l'éducation adéquate. Nous, on a toujours eu tendance d'uniformiser l'éducation par rapport à ce qui se passe aux États-Unis ou dans d'autres pays. Mais il faut voir le cœur, du développement, il faut voir les ressources existantes et il faut utiliser nos jeunes pour répondre vraiment sur cela. Finalement, il faut aider les jeunes, vu que nous sommes la majorité de la population. Les jeunes ont des projets, les jeunes ont des idées très innovantes, mais il faut leur aider à transformer cette idée en une entreprise. On a besoin de tutorat, on a besoin de formation, on a besoin d'accompagnement, et même dans les bases sur le montage de projets. On a la conviction, mais vraiment, il faut aider les jeunes. Merci.
Very good. Quite a mouthful of things there, but definitely very important points. Youth participation is definitely key, something we strongly believe in, particularly from the bank, Africa Development Bank. And I think that the point you make was also highlighted here, that we are not getting good returns from the current education system. So I have to come back to Your Excellency. And what is it that we can actually do? What are the 3 things that you think could fundamentally address this issue?
Well, Yanni, I'm very happy to hear the comments from our youngest member of the panel, because I agree with her completely. Actually, just to be bold and be clear about it, in Egypt we realized that this is the situation, and we had to, we benefit from a very strong political will at the highest level to really change it. And we took a decision to dismantle our education system, the general education, and build a new one, really, on a plain sheet of paper, which is not an easy adventure. Especially that we have about 22 million students in the current system and 3 million in the higher education system. But we took a decision a few years ago to begin a new system that addresses those concerns of the young people, that there is this disconnect. And also because of the unemployment rates, which the governor this morning mentioned they went down. Yes, they did, but the majority of those have higher education degrees. This is the interesting part, that we have to ask the question, how do we invest all of this in the standard old-fashioned education system and end up unemployed? So something is wrong here in this path. And we realized that. So we had to re-envision how do we want our child who's in KG to look like 16 years down the road? Or what kind of skills in the 21st century really we want to impart to those kids? So we have already delivered the new system from the ground up. It now reached second grade. We started from the ground up, from KG1, KG2, first and second grade. So we have new curricula, new skills, new way of learning to help those kids have real jobs at the end of the day. That's number one. But then we have more problems than that. Again, I have to re-emphasize the culture of the parents are putting a lot of pressure on the younger people because the parents have an influence on the decision-making of the young. They force them to go to the socially prestigious kind of end results, not what the market needs, or not what their hobbies or ambitions are. So that's another problem. But things really changed, and we have to change accordingly. People have degrees. We have lots of doctors and engineers who are unemployed, and that's a real problem. So we are changing our general education system, and we have to think of admission to college. We have a free education system in Egypt, and in the constitution, everyone is guaranteed a place in higher education. Now that's a problem, because here you do the math of accepting people whether you need them or not. So you have to find them a seat, and that ends up graduating people in certain sectors that you have no enough jobs for them. So that's where the frustration comes from. So we have to think of the admission and creating opportunities for people in higher education. So we are working, the two ministries here, education and higher education, together to change the way we do admission, direct students to areas where there are jobs. I'm talking general education. Technical education is a different ball game. But in most countries, technical education is also run by not one ministry. It depends where you are. So in Egypt, it's fragmented between our ministry, Ministry of Industry and Trade, health, because of nurses, tourism, because of those specialties. So it's scattered. The governance is a problem, and the policy making is a problem. How we solved it? We built a completely new general education system. Now we are doing a completely new technical education system, which is competency-based and industry-driven, completely industry-driven. But the issue of quality and the decent jobs, they're kind of connected. The industries in the developing world are not advanced themselves. So if they are industry-driven, we are teaching those kids low-quality skills. We wanted to raise the bar. So we wanted to have, for example, we are working with the Germans to have a quality control agency. We wanted the skills given to Egyptian students be certified by such a high standard so that the graduate can work in a factory in Germany with the same degree. That then we know that these skills are up to par internationally, not just at the national benchmark. So we wanted to raise the bar. So it's a mix of that. But for the equity issue, which is very important, we actually use technology. I think we have an experiment in Egypt that is really a real case on the ground for social inclusion, that we really afforded the poorest student the same opportunity that the richest might have. And that's using technology. We did that experiment in high school starting last year. We gave every student in high school, it's all free education, I'm talking about government schools, state-of-the-art tablets, and we invested, the country invested in a huge repository of content, reviewed content for education. We call it the Egyptian Knowledge Bank, which is something we can work with our colleagues in Africa to spread it out. It's authentic, reviewed material designed for education and made accessible to the poorest child in the country for free. And the exams reach them the same way using technology. So we have pictures of students in farms and barefooted, but they have actually the same exact content and devices of anyone in the most expensive private school. And that is very important to us. So everything we are talking about, whether in general education or technical, is free of charge. And I have to tell you that the women in Egypt, the girls, are now advancing very quickly, that the top 10 students in technical education in the last 3 years were girls, or 9 out of 10. In disciplines we never believed they would go to, industrial disciplines, engine fixing, air conditioning, they go to very tough disciplines and they are really good at it. So we have good experiences we'll be more than happy to share. And I was talking to colleagues about also, we invented something we call the smart classrooms, which are to solve the infrastructure problem in remote areas away from the cities, which could contribute to solving that problem. Those classrooms can be assembled and put in place in less than 72 hours, complete with smart technology, with solar power, with everything. It's a turnkey solution. So in a village, you can introduce a complete solution in a very short time, whether it's about vocational training, about learning how to program, about being a school or a clinic. So there are few tools by which we can conquer those problems that you are hearing, but that's at least our experience.
Very good. Very impressive that you are actually able to revamp the entire system and to take advantage of technology to provide access. But Dr. Mose, hearing all this, what would be the 3 things that you want to leave us with in terms of addressing this problem?
Well, I think there are things that we need to focus on. Definitely, like getting the skills issue right is fundamental. Getting the right matching between what the education system produces and the workplace is essential. And this will need to, I'm delighted to hear all the great efforts that are being done in Egypt in terms of really like utilizing all these technological advances, doing new interventions and so on. And that's very positive. What we need also to ensure in general in Africa is that these type of like education reforms are done hand in hand and in conjunction with the private sector, so that you can actually design the reforms that closely meet the needs of the workplace. So having some sort of like a public-private dialogue on education reform will be key to advance, and keeping an eye on the future and how you can actually leapfrog. So examples like what the Honorable Minister mentioned in terms of using technology to your advantage. For example, in using technology to provide education to remote areas, to raise the bar in terms of quality. This is what really Africa needs. I mean, we're going to face challenges in terms of adapting our systems with the 4th Industrial Revolution, but in the same time, this is a huge opportunity for us to turn these challenges into opportunities to leapfrog the development. So that would be key. Then the other issue is to make sure that we have the enabling environment to actually help the demand side grow. So basically to create sufficient jobs from the private sector to absorb all these new entrants to the workplace. And here we will need to, for governments to ensure that we have this enabling business environment, improved access to finance, access to markets, and we are very delighted that now we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that will open new markets within the continents that were not possible before. So all these type of issues in terms of access to market, access to finance, and regulatory and legal framework will be key, and helping this entrepreneurship spirit in the continent to foster, for us to see these small and medium enterprises grow to be large and create jobs.
Right, thank you very much. Mr. Gilpin, what do you think would be, let's say, the 3 things that if we do, we could see progress in the coming years?
Thank you very much. 3 is a small number.
There's
many
more,
things to
right.
do, but let me start with this. I think, first of all, I would focus mainly on entrepreneurship.
Right.
I think, first of all, we need to map Africa's entrepreneurship ecosystem. Who is involved, who are the stakeholders, which institutions and policies are necessary, so we could better understand how best to intervene from country to country. Mm-hmm. In some situations, what we might need is to revamp the educational system. In other situations, it might be removing some of the non-tariff barriers to trade. So mapping the ecosystem, I think, is a necessary first for everyone. Mm-hmm. Second, and in the context of this event, I think we need to do a little bit more research into what works for an African context. Remember when, it might come as a surprise to many people, but there was a recent survey as to which institutions multilateral institutions doing the most for social investments, and it came out the IMF is number 1, and number 2, it was number 1. One, partly because they focused on something called macro criticality, to see how their social investments could be tailored to support the macro side. And on the African side, I think we need to introduce a concept of Afro-criticality, how we could make policies and institutions more fit for purpose in an African context, where the vast majority of the population are unbanked. So your traditional bank-led solutions wouldn't work, where the non-formal sector is in many cases more credible than the formal sector. So how do we have this Afro-criticality that makes a difference? And the third thing I think we need to do a little bit more is we need to coordinate the interests and the activities of stakeholders. I spoke about Youth Connect earlier. We're hearing what everybody is doing. African countries are being bombarded with good ideas from all corners. How do we coordinate all of these so that we are meeting the need where African countries and where African youth populations are at the moment? I think if we map the ecosystem, right, if we are able to do a little bit more in terms of Afro-criticality, and thirdly, we coordinate the stakeholders, I think we are on a path to addressing some of these issues.
Okay, very good. Director Eiraika, what are your thoughts? You did bring in a very interesting dimension of the informal economy, saying that our problem is as much of underemployment as it is unemployment. So what would be your concluding remarks?
Well, my concluding remark is about the youth who are out of formal education or who do not make it to formal education. Unfortunately, up to now, about 1/3 of African youth either drop out of school or do not go to school at all. This is a huge number. I think we need to have targeted training and skills development programs for those youth. And we see those mostly in rural areas, a huge number. And they represent a huge problem that needs to be addressed. The ripples we see, the ripple groups we see in many countries, and the troubles associated with migration, crimes, normally come from these groups of young people who have no opportunities. So I think we need to do a lot to provide opportunities for those young people. And I was actually wondering if the Honorable Minister of Egypt could tell us about this segment of the population, Egypt. Because what he told us about the education in Egypt is really exemplary. Thank you.
That's okay. That's a very good point. We do have young people that are not in education and not in employment. And yes, they present also quite a big challenge. You're absolutely right. Before I finalize with an overview from Professor Borat, I just want to get the last few words or message from Juliana as a young person. If you were to solve this problem yourself, what would you do?
Merci beaucoup. Avant de répondre à votre question, j'aimerais profiter aussi de cette occasion pour vous partager toute la situation que la jeunesse africaine endure actuellement, en l'occurrence l'Union panafricaine de la jeunesse. En 2017, on a effectué un grand plaidoyer au 29e sommet des chefs d'État par rapport à la mise en place du Fonds africain pour le développement de la jeunesse. Et ça a été adopté pendant ce 29e conférence, ce 29e sommet. Normalement, l'opérationnalisation de ce fonds doit être opérationnelle depuis l'année 2018. Mais jusqu'à maintenant, ça n'a pas pu aboutir et on n'a pas reçu ce financement à une hauteur de 7 millions de dollars qui a été approuvé par les chefs d'État. Suite à cela, on a été victime d'injustice au niveau de notre mère, qui est l'Union africaine, puisqu'on a passé à une élection en 2018, on a passé à l'élection, et on nous a traités d'incorrompus.
Juliana, try to be precise, just 3 things.
Yes. Et on nous a traités d'incorrompus. L'Union panafricaine de la jeunesse a été personnalisée par une personne, alors que nous, tous membres du comité exécutif, nous sommes vraiment des leaders qui veulent faire changer l'Afrique. Donc là, je fais des plaidoyers auprès de vous, honorables ministres, auprès de vous aussi, honorables invités, et aussi les chercheurs, de nous aider dans la réforme de l'Union panafricaine de la jeunesse. Quand je dis réforme, c'est-à-dire sur la base des conseils nationaux de la jeunesse. On a actuellement 44 pays qui ont des conseils nationaux de la jeunesse au sein de l'Union panafricaine de la jeunesse. Je rebondis maintenant à notre thématique. Je partage un peu l'expérience de Madagascar, comme je suis malgache, pour la cartographie. On est actuellement en phase de faire la cartographie de tous les acteurs en entrepreneuriat, que ce soit les associations des jeunes, les entreprises publiques et privées, les ministères qui ont des programmes sur l'entrepreneuriat des jeunes, les partenaires financiers. Et aussi, je partage aussi cette expérience par rapport à la mise en confiance des jeunes. Il faut faire confiance aux jeunes, il faut donner confiance aux jeunes. Nos textes disent dans la Charte africaine de la jeunesse qu'il faut donner les responsabilités, les postes de responsabilité aux jeunes. Et pour Madagascar, nous avons un jeune président qui est le président Andjiratsouil. Il a mis en place notre ministre qui est jeune et m'a aussi désigné directeur général de la jeunesse. Ça, c'est vraiment une preuve de la mise en œuvre de cette charte africaine de la jeunesse. Et pour conclure, il faut appuyer les jeunes dans la création des entreprises en leur donnant des formations, en leur donnant de l'accompagnement. Et tous ensemble, on peut changer l'Afrique, on peut changer le monde. Merci beaucoup.
Very good. Thank you very much. And perhaps, Professor Borat, you made very good observations. We have had a lot of good suggestions and ways forward. How would you conclude this? How would we help African countries to really get around this problem?
So perhaps more just to try and coalesce around some of my panelists' excellent comments. I mean, it struck me that that one can frame the set of comments according to sort of four big categories. One was around the problem of skills mismatch. The second is the structure of growth. The third is the structure of employment. And the fourth is looking forward, how do you unlock growth? just very briefly, I mean, there were concerns around the skills match, which the Honourable Minister mentioned, which interestingly is not unusual, that in many African countries, I think in many developing countries, there's a premium placed on attending a university as opposed to a TVET college. And I think that's a cultural constraint. It's a country cultural constraint. That we have a famous politician in South Africa who says that township culture needs to change, that it's much better to become a plumber than to get a degree in philosophy. And I think that's the switch that needs to happen. But there are structural constraints which the Minister alluded to as well. So the structural constraints are that many of our higher education systems are not pricing the need for TVET systems correctly. So we provide bursaries to university students rather than to TVET colleges. And even if the funding to TVET colleges is usually on a per capita basis, it's lower than for universities. So I think there are a whole range of skills mismatch issues which we need to dig a bit deeper. Colleagues mentioned the curriculum content indirectly, the fact that we maybe are not educating people for the fourth industrial revolution, so a whole lot of issues. The structure of growth, I just want to underline the fact that we need to be realistic about the high growth economist headline. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were from Africa. Well, 14 of those 17 economies, those African lions, were resource dependent. So these are commodity super cycle growth paths, right? So as soon as the commodity super cycle ends, Angola is nowhere to be seen any longer, and it's not surprising. So I think we need to be realistic about how sustainable the growth trajectory and the structure of our growth paths are. And I think that's, in a sense, what I try to do in the presentation, is take us to that conversation. And then I think there was a great point from Hanan about the structure of employment. And I'm glad you picked up on this thing about public sector employment. And therefore, as a mirror image, where's private sector employment growth going to come from? And I think that's the conversation that matches the growth trajectory to employment, which is, if the private sector is not a dominant employer, then I think we have trouble in terms of breaking, if you like, that 4-3-2-1 segmented model. We want to move people from vulnerable employment into productive employment. And then just very quickly, how do you unlock growth? I think there's the constraints model, again, the idea of the regulatory environment, entrepreneurship was mentioned, and I think all of those matter. I would again argue, not to punt the economic complexity story, but I think if you go at the level of the firm, let's generalize it. I think conversations with firms need to happen far more often. Ask firms where the constraints lie. Ask firms where they can grow their markets. And I think often you'll find the answers to unlocking growth lie with the firms themselves.
Very good. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much for an excellent conversation with us. I would like to invite you, as you stand up, for a quick photograph. I have a request from photographers who might want to take a photograph of the panel. And for the rest of the delegates, lunch will be served from now. Thank you.